expert panel is Suzie Brady, who's Director of Communications at IT company Adobe, Amelia Tandy, Executive Officer to the CSIRO's Research Director at the Climate Science Centre, and Mary Harwood, a Senior Facilitator and Advisor at Ethos CRS, where we are today, and a former Senior Public Servant. Our panel will also be taking your questions, so please send them to us here on the chat function. So, let's start with Suzie. What do you think are the special things that women bring to leadership? What is the value of female leadership?
Yeah, I think importantly, women bring a different point of view, and I think diversity is so important in any sector, right? Be it government or business, anywhere. Diversity is important. Women bring another point of view, and I think they bring a really nice, well-rounded point of view to the table.
Mm-hmm. Amelia?
Yes, I'd agree with Suzie, and I think, again, diversity is really important. I think there's a lot of research out there now which shows that the more diverse your team is, the better the results that you get. And I think it's also important to remember that, you know, there are almost 4 billion women in the world, and we are quite a diverse group amongst ourselves as well. And so by bringing a broader group of women to the table, you get that extra level of diversity.
So having more equal numbers in the company, the department, the table, around the table. Mary, what do you think are the special things women bring?
I think individually they bring their own qualities, but also if you have a few women in leadership, you're missing out on a lot of talent. That is, if you draw the best from both men and women, you'll end up with a balanced team that performs much better than one that misses out a large chunk of the population.
And has that been your experience when there's been more women?
Yes, I think it's an interesting, there seems also almost to be a sort of critical point where you get a certain number of women in leadership positions and the chemistry of the organisation changes, and I think it's for the better.
Mm-hmm. Do women leaders actually lead differently from men, and should they? Mary, I'll return to you with this one.
I hesitate to stereotype. I think, yes, there are differences, but there's also things that are the same about good leaders. But I think generally a capacity to listen and a capacity to draw people towards agreement that more women bring than men, that a capacity to help people see where the point of agreement is.
Would you agree with that, Amelia? You're obviously younger than Mary, but is that experience similar to Mary's?
Yes, I think so. I was lucky enough to participate in a leadership program last year, and one of the things that we talked about was that, as Mary said, women can be quite strong on collaboration and teamwork and listening, as Mary said. So I do think that that's something that's really important for all leaders, and indeed, you know, I've had some great male leaders myself who have displayed those qualities, but I think at a general level, I think that's something that women can be quite strong at.
Mm-hmm. And Suzie?
Listening and collaboration, absolutely, and also that life experience as well that sort of comes to the table, I think, and they're more willing to put it forward. I think that helps too.
Do women, or rather do people expect different things from women leaders? Do they expect them to be collaborative? Do they expect them to listen? And what happens when they don't? Suzie?
I think it depends. I think, you know, sometimes I think there are just a lot of biases out there, and I think sometimes we expect women leaders to be just like men. And, you know, I think that's an interesting kind of concept, and I think the more that women can just bring themselves and like I said before, their own point of view to the table, I think that's a great thing. But yes, I do think people expect different things of women. I think we've seen that, especially in politics.
And also I think a lot of women have experienced women leaders who do behave like men.
Yeah.
They don't actually listen or collaborate.
That's
maybe
right.
That's in the old days, but maybe it's changed. I don't. Mary, what do you think about that? Do you think people expect different things from women?
Yes, I think there are circumstances where they actually seek a woman because that collaborative role is central to whatever needs to be done. I know at times in my career that it was that sort of capacity was what meant that I got the job. But I think you're right in the other comments you made that some women leaders basically just become sort of clones of a sort of male stereotype. They can be pretty tough to work for as a woman or as a man, just as the same thing in terms of a man with those qualities. I think it's the sort of warmth and sensitivity and capacity to listen and care perhaps is more evident in women leaders, but it's also in men as well.
Amelia, what's your view on that?
So I would agree, and I would add that I think we sometimes we use different words and values differently to men and women. So an example that I can think of from my work recently is around the word ambition. So often for men, if you associate a man as being ambitious, that's seen very much as a positive trait. But I have seen plenty of examples where people will say, men and women will say, oh, that woman's very ambitious, and it has a very strong negative connotation to it. And so I think we all need to think about, how, why is that the case? Why is it okay for a man to be ambitious, but it's not okay for a woman to be ambitious?
I think there's numerous examples like that, aren't there? The Chief Operating Officer of Pinterest said just this week that when men speak out, they're rewarded, and when women speak out, they are sacked, which is what's happened to her. And we might talk about discrimination in a moment. Julia Gillard recently said that we're all products of our cultures and societies, and socialisation means we do have gender stereotypes that whisper to us in the back of our brain and influence how we see and judge people, which I think is exactly, it hits the nail on the head. How do we overcome gender stereotypes and unconscious bias? Because we are humans. What does it take? Suzie?
I think it's mindfulness all the time. We have to think about it. When we're hiring people, we have to think about who we're bringing into the organisation and really make sure that diversity is really top of mind. And the other thing for me is if you are in a leadership position, lead by example. Demonstrate the behaviours that you want to see in other people. I think that's what we need to be thinking about.
We'll come back to the question, but does that mean you need to have quotas?
I was thinking about this before we came on, and I think in some cases it would be useful because what we're doing today is clearly not working. So I think quotas in some respects could be useful.
Amelia, back to the question, how do you think we overcome gender stereotypes, and especially unconscious bias, which I think is the hardest thing to overcome?
So I think, as Suzie said, mindfulness, like first of all, we need to acknowledge that it exists for all of us. An example that I think of for myself is that when I was having my first child and I was in the hospital, towards the end, a male midwife came in, and I kind of had this initial option of, oh, what's the man doing in here? Like, he's got no business being a midwife, which is ridiculous because there are actually more male obstetricians than there are female ones. So why is it okay to have a male obstetrician but not a male midwife? And he was actually fantastic. But so, acknowledging that we all have those unconscious biases and being willing to be open to exploring it and reflecting it and becoming aware of it. And then I also think it's really important to, I heard somebody say this phrase recently on a podcast, it's important to let people shift with dignity. So let people shift their position in a way that is kind and caring and helping them to shift their position rather than shaming them and blaming them.
Can you think of any examples where that's worked?
So I can think of an example in my office. I used to work at the Department of Environment, and there were some people talking, and it was a bit of a sexist conversation because it was about a person and how they looked. It was positive, but it's still, it wasn't really appropriate. And somebody in our team just said, oh, I don't really think it's okay, to be having this conversation. And it just made everybody pause, think, and everybody acknowledged that actually it wasn't appropriate, and we all moved on. So it did, in that situation, allow people to, you know, kind of deal with the situation in a quiet and calm way. You know, I totally accept that there are examples where, you know, a much firmer response is required, but I think for unconscious biases that are just in our daily lives, you know, you can let people know without, you know, shaming them in front of a whole group of people.
It takes courage too, doesn't it?
It does. It does.
And Mary, what do you think about what we can do to overcome gender stereotypes and unconscious bias? And gender stereotypes, it is this whispering at the back of our brain.
It is. There's a lot of whispering. I think the first of all is to look at your own whispering, whatever form that whisper takes. I mean, I think, for instance, if you're a young woman and you have whispering thoughts about the capacities of older women, you'll experience those when you become an older woman. You know, there's a whole lot of whispering, not just male, female, that the more you're aware of your own whispering and willing to challenge it and change it. The other thing is, I'd really agree with Amelia that picking your moment when you call out subtleties of whether it's language or behaviour, sometimes it's appropriate to do it on the spot and say, hey, that's not okay. Like if someone does something in a meeting that is really not okay, if you don't say anything, you're saying it's okay. But there'll be other times when you might take someone aside for a coffee later and say, do you realise when you address Suzie or Amelia in meetings, you speak differently to them? There's a patronising tone to the way you speak. And you do it in the least, you don't want to bring up their hackles, you want them to just have a look and judge whether that person, you know, is up for that conversation and see whether they're willing to change. So I think it's a real mixture of being in the moment and making sort of real-time decisions about when you see bias manifest, what you do about it.
What do you do if you're a younger person with lower down on the on the levels as compared to the person who is saying the discriminatory or unconscious bias statement? How do you tackle that when you're fearful it might affect your career opportunities or the way that person perceives you for whatever reason? Everyone, start with you.
Well, I think sometimes you can do it with humour. I've actually said to someone quite senior to me, sometimes it feels like you think women have smaller brains, but they don't. You know, they really don't. They might think differently or speak differently, but they've got just as much to contribute, but do it with a lot of affection, as not in a sort of in-your-face sort of way. But I'm not saying it's easy, and the further the power gap, whatever the issue is, the more the way you communicate is going to affect whether you live long and prosper.
Yeah, very difficult, I think, especially if there is a big gap between your level and the senior person. And I think maybe if it's not something that you're comfortable broaching with them directly, maybe there's somebody else that you can talk to in the organisation and get advice, that sort of thing. So yeah, really difficult.
Very tricky. Yeah, I wonder if there's room for special training in this area for companies, for any organisation that has a lot of men and women working together, where people actually have to consciously think about these issues too.
Yeah, we certainly have it at Adobe. We all have to do training around unconscious bias, and it's just quite extraordinary. I think I'm quite an open-minded person, and I still learned a lot from that.
Does it have an impact afterwards? It has an impact
absolutely.
at the time?
I think so, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a great thing to do, and I think it should be something that all organisations are thinking about.
I'd like to go back to the Pinterest case, because this is very high profile this week with the Chief Operating Officer taking on one of the big tech companies, not one of the huge ones, but multi-billion-dollar companies. When she said men are rewarded for speaking up, women are sacked, do you think that's actually the case in Australia? What do you think, Suzie?
I think, look, I'm not sure about the being sacked part of that comment, but I think in a lot of cases, men are very vocal when they are sitting around the table. And I think, you know, when I was certainly coming up through the ranks, I'm not an extroverted person. I want to say something when I think I've got something of value to say. And I think it's very easy to be drowned out. And so I think I certainly have seen that in Australia. I think there are a lot of times I've been sitting in meetings and you actually listen to the conversation and you think, did we really need to repeat that 5 times? I don't think so. You know, I think, I think that is the case here.
Suzie, what about? Amelia, what do you think about that? Do you think that is the case? Have you seen it in the public service?
So not to that extent, but
names,
yes, I have seen examples of if a woman voices concerns, then you know she's kind of seen as the troublemaker. But if a man could essentially voice the exact same concern, then it's like, oh yes, great idea. He's an innovative thinker. And I think it's a broader cultural issue as well. Like I think, when I'm 40, so when I was a little girl, you get this cultural message in Australia of, just be the good girl, just be quiet and be a good girl. But, my brother wasn't told to be a good boy. So, I think that plays into it as well.
Mary?
Yeah, I think men are used to having their voices heard. So they come from a point of comfort in meetings and life experience. And so that it's all the things that Suzie was saying about that sometimes it can be because you don't need to contribute and they do for whatever reason, but it can also be that there's just, meanwhile back at the whispering, that the whispering says, they get first go. Men get first go in a meeting or a conversation, or their voice is important, and that's all the whispering is both male and female is sort of so that consciously changing it by some of the things in terms of just practicing meetings where people speak in turn and you cannot speak out of turn. Just to work an issue in a different way can really change the dynamic of the conversation and that's not just about men and women, that can be about the people who dominate a conversation and the people who sit back. Just changing the way that works so that you draw a different dialogue out of the group.
It's having a good share of the meeting too, isn't it?
Excellent, yes.
I think it comes back to those behaviours I was talking about in leading by example. So if you're chairing that meeting, make sure you're hearing from everybody around the table because that's going to bring that diversity of thought that's going to push an idea to another level.
And that in turn comes back to dealing with unconscious bias and just being super conscious of unconscious bias, which is, I guess it's training, it's repetitive behaviour.
It's a muscle that I think you have to build and keep working on.
Yeah, and some people just don't want to, do they? Because for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Whatever reason. Okay, this one's on a more personal level. Have you ever encountered workplace discrimination? Who'd like to go first?
We'll look at
I'll go first. So, fortunately in Australia, I've experienced very, little discrimination that I've been aware of. I think it's mostly all been sort of, inadvertent things like, it's always the women who unload the dishwasher in the staff kitchen, and it's always the women who are asked to take minutes in meetings, and, little, smaller things like that. When I was younger, I worked in South Africa for a year as a 24-year-old, and I'd had quite a different experience there where I did experience a lot of sexist behaviour, but it was 10 years after apartheid had ended, so it was quite a different place then to what it is now, and also it was just, it was a very different place to Australia at that time. So,
And you handled this discrimination in a way that you can look back on now and think, I did the right thing?
For the most part, I think partly I was just lucky as well, that it didn't escalate too much, but I think I was also very unprepared for it. I mean, I think really I had a very, protective childhood and upbringing here mostly in Canberra and Adelaide here in Australia, and I think I went there quite naive, and when I first started encountering it, I was quite shocked and didn't really know how to respond. So it was something that I had to learn very quickly about how to handle it.
So it may go to how we raise our children too, what we as people who can influence the behaviour of others say to young people who may be starting out in their careers as well. Mary, what about you? Workplace discrimination?
A couple of things that I'd say. I mean, I think I had a relatively charmed life working in government, and I had people, both men and women, who sort of had my back or helped me progress through the system. I did have, when I was first aspiring to be a senior executive, I had a boss say to me, "Oh, we don't think you're tough enough," and that had a lot of meaning in it for me, because I didn't want to become a sort of male tough clone, whatever, but I was working as a negotiator already and doing what I thought was a reasonable job and getting good results. And yet he obviously had a picture in his mind of what tough should look like, and I don't know what I would have had to have done to have met that model. One other thing I would recall is that when I in my 20s, I worked as a musician, and the first job I got was in an orchestra, and I was so excited. And my teacher, who was the most wonderful man on earth, said to me, "Mary, you've got the job in the orchestra, but the person who came second is a man, and he has a family, so you should stand aside." And I remember thinking, what do I do? And I didn't, I confess. I went and I took the job and really enjoyed it. But it wasn't done with any malice at all. It was literally just, this man needs to provide for his family. You're a single woman, you shouldn't take the job. And it was startling. But maybe that was a different era, hopefully.
Yeah. Just on the point about the manager who said to you you weren't tough enough, did he offer advice on how to toughen up?
No, it was a bit like when people say, "I think you need to be more strategic," and you go, what exactly are we talking about here? And they sort of fumble around, because there's a couple of words that are ungraspable for what it is you need to change. I mean, I don't know whether I was supposed to walk around carrying a machete or what. I have no idea.
It is odd, isn't it, to say that to someone without really helping. Maybe you were a threat. Suzie.
It's an interesting one, because I think as well I've had some incredible leaders and mentors and advocates in my career that I still really look up to. But when you really start drilling into it, sometimes it is those more mundane things like, who's going to do the coffee run? And then when I really thought about it, I have been asked how old I am. I have been asked if I have children. When do I plan to have children? And really that is not appropriate, and that is discrimination. So I think overall, a pretty good experience, but yeah, definitely some things that
have slipped through. And were your mentors male and female?
Yeah, I've had both male and female, but I guess I sort of lean towards my female leaders as the ones I sort of aspire to the most.
Amelia, what about you? Mentors, have they been a big part of your life?
Absolutely. Mary is one of my mentors, and I worked for her for a long time ago, and she's been my mentor ever since. But I think for me, I've had men and women, but for me, it's very much about the personal connection and how well I get along with them. So I think I've been very lucky to have both male and female great mentors. But I think it's really important. I think, I really believe that you can't be what you can't see. So I think for me, I've had a lot of wonderful female leaders in my time in the public service and also now at CSIRO, and I think that's really helped me a lot, and it's impacted the perspective that I have.
Is it a given today that both men and women should be mentors to I want to say just women, the women who work for them, but I guess they really have to be mentors to everyone, don't they? Should they be more of a mentor to women?
I think if you're going to be a mentor, you have to want to be a mentor as a thing, and then you have to want to be a mentor to that person. So I've seen various schemes sort of where you try and apply a sort of one-size-fits-all mentoring model over a department, and they're not that successful. Or what happens is it falls away and just the ones that actually work stay on. I don't think that. I think for women, having women mentors does make a difference, but I don't. I think it can work in all directions. It's really more about the chemistry of the relationship and genuinely having the mentee, I hate that word, the mentee's interests and future at heart, and being willing to push them and challenge them if need be. Yeah.
What about misogyny? The word that really Julia Gillard really elevated that word to something that probably most of us haven't even thought about for a long time, if at all. Have any of you encountered misogyny at any stages in your career, Suzie?
I have. I started my career as a journalist and worked in a Sydney radio station where there was a very high-profile person in there who was absolutely a misogynist and would walk through the newsroom and not acknowledge any of the women in the room, only address the men, only liaise with the men, and all of the women were completely ignored. So that was something that I saw at a very early stage in my career, and it was accepted at the time from the senior management down.
I wonder if it'd be any different today.
I'd like to think so.
Amelia, what about you? Have you ever encountered misogyny?
No, so fortunately not. But something that opened my eyes last year was doing this leadership course for women in STEM, and just hearing a lot of stories from the scientists that I met about, a lot of them had experienced misogyny, and I think science compared to the public sector, there is a much bigger gap in terms of women in leadership roles in science compared to the public sector as a whole. And I was quite shocked by some of the experiences that some of those women had.
What would be the one that really stands out in your mind? Can you remember?
A couple that, basically women had, their supervisor or one of their lecturers had made sexual advances towards them, and it was basically implied that, if you want this postdoc position or, you're doing a PhD or whatever, you need to come away with me. So, I just, again, I was naive and had a nice little protected upbringing, and that really shocked me.
It is shocking. It is shocking.
Yeah.
Mary, what about you? Misogyny?
I don't know that it's misogyny, but it's the sort of assumption that you're not capable. I remember once I was chairing my first meeting with a bunch of, rough fishermen somewhere in Queensland, and this guy came up and said, "Hello, girlie, you're here to hold the pen, are you?" And then I came to the microphone and said, "Well, welcome everybody. We're here to discuss the closure of the blah blah fishery." And I could see this guy go, "What?" But then when we were doing some consultations on a major reform, I was travelling with a woman minister, and I saw just this. It would take her. She was a marvellous person to work with, and just the assumptions of the wall she had to get through first with people who were sort of like, why on earth should I have this conversation with a woman? So it was sort of like, it was just a harder job. And when women were leading those conversations, if we were doing it at the bureaucratic level, your first pass was to get to the point where you almost had to sort of present yourself to a point where they could go, "Oh yeah, okay, I'll have a conversation with you." So I don't know if that's misogyny. I think it's some just sort of chunky unconscious bias.
Yeah. and the massive cultural.
Yeah.
Let's hope there has been a shift, because it does sound.
Some of that's fairly recent.
Oh, sorry. Now, what is? Let's try to end on a really positive note, because I think there have been massive positive developments. Just look at the women we're seeing on the news during the whole COVID disaster, catastrophe. What is the single biggest thing that can help women who want to become leaders? Amelia?
So I think there's lots of things to do, but one thing that stood out for me, and again because of my experience last year, is really support networks. So for me, I did this 12-month leadership course. It culminated in a 3-week voyage to Antarctica, and when I signed up, I was like, "Oh my gosh, I'm going to Antarctica! That's amazing!" But in hindsight, actually the most amazing thing for me from that whole experience was the network. And by putting us all together in a boat, about 99 women from 33 countries, ranging in age from 23 to 70, and the faculty really went out of their way to cultivate the most supportive environment that I've ever been in my whole life, and to physically see myself how that lifted everybody up together. There was no competition, no criticism. It was lifting everybody up together and valuing everybody as an individual. So I think for the women out there, I would say, find that supportive network for yourself. It can be online, it can be with friends, it can be with peers. Try and look to make it more diverse as well. Don't just look in your own, little sphere. Try and find somewhere else. But I think, having that supportive network, it had a huge difference on me.
Wonderful. Mary, what about you?
Yeah, I think networks are vital, and I think if you get into more senior positions, having friends in, whether they're in the same or different organisations who are handling the same sort of challenges. We used to have a group called the Ducking Out Club of senior executives and women, and on Friday night we would go out and eat duck, and whoever had the roughest week, we would unpack that and help each other solve it. So I think that's important. I think the other thing is, don't try and be something you're not. Like, don't try and strive, whatever the model is whispering that you should be like this, just work out who you are, be aware of your own biases and your own capacities and your weaknesses, and work with that rather than trying to sort of arrive at work as something other than what you truly are.
Very important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Suzie.
There's sort of two ways I'm looking at this. The first one is around, just as I said earlier in the session, if you are in a leadership position, be the leader that people are going to aspire to be. Make sure that you're, asking people for their opinions and bringing diversity forward. So it's really, I guess, an ask of leaders to really demonstrate those behaviours that we need to see. And then secondly, for people who are coming up and want to be leaders, absolutely agree with Mary. Don't change who you are. Bring yourself forward. But the other thing is, if you have a seat at the table, have an opinion. And maybe you might wait a little bit and you won't be the loudest voice at the table, but if you've been asked to a meeting, it's usually for a reason. So make sure you come and have done your work and have an opinion and let people know about it.
That actually segues in perfectly to the first question that we have here, and that is, how do you have a voice in a team of men?
Yeah.
So who'd like to take that, Mary?
Well, I think be yourself is the starter,
Yeah.
but be willing to speak up. I mean, some people are sort of naturally extrovert, others aren't. But if you don't contribute if you know there's something that people need to consider or do in a meeting and you don't say it, then that's their loss and that's the organisation's loss. So be willing to speak up and be willing to read the room if you're pushing hard on something, and be sensitive to the way you communicate. It's not that you've got to be a sort of timorous beastie, but that you do it in a way where you don't get people's backs up, who may, if there's some of the old guard around the table.
I think there's practical things you can do around that. I'm from personal experience, not being an extrovert, I would, sit there in meetings and find it very difficult to find my voice and think, oh my goodness, I'm going to sound stupid, or I'm not going to sound like I know what I'm talking about. And somebody said to me, force yourself to say something, whatever the meeting is, whatever that is, and you just get in the habit of it. So it's just a practical thing that you can actually do, and you suddenly start realising people are listening and it's all okay.
And does some of that come to preparation for the meeting, or is it listening better at the meeting? Is it?
I think it's a combination of both of those things.
Amelia, do you have a view on that? How do you have a voice in a team of men?
So I was once the only woman in a team of men, and I think something that works for me, because I'm also an introvert and find it hard to speak in meetings, but something that worked for me in that situation was I worked really hard to develop relationships with each of the other men in my team on an individual level, so one-on-one. So, we'd just go and have coffee, or I'd ask them to, can we chat about this issue or whatever it was, and through that process over time, I developed strong, individual relationships with each of them, and that really, increased their respect for me, and that then meant that they actually, included for me more, at a team level.
And want to listen to what you have to
exactly.
say. Yeah.
Exactly.
Our next question, how can men best support women in their teams? Which I think we touched on this, but let's go over that again. How can men best support the women in their teams? Suzie.
Mindfulness, we've spoken about, being aware, self-awareness, and really being open to hearing different voices, and everything from whether you're sitting at a meeting or whether you're looking to make a hire or an organisational change. I think it's being aware of diversity all the time.
And I guess being really aware of your own unconscious bias.
That's right. That's self-awareness.
Yeah. Amelia?
So,
how can men best support women?
Yeah, so I'd like to draw on the example of CSIRO CEO at the minute, Larry Marshall. Larry, it's clear to me that Larry genuinely cares about diversity and inclusive issues, and something that he's become a male champion of change in our organisation, and something that he does is he's very conscious of things about panels. So he's wrote in the organisational newsletter about how he was invited to sit on this panel. He noticed that, it was a panel of all old white men. He said, oh, look, sorry, maybe you should, consider, this person instead, or I'd like you to have, a more diverse panel. In one instance, he got no response, so he didn't go to that panel. In another example, they actually brought in a woman from South Africa to join him on the panel. And so I think, one, that's him making a difference himself at a personal level, but I think because he's doing it as the CEO, he's creating the authorising environment for all the men in our organisation to do the same thing, and to say, oh, that's something that I can do in my day-to-day life to make a difference, and actually it's okay for me to do that. My organisation supports that approach.
And he's effectively a public leader too, given his role, isn't he? So to have someone in that role behaving like that is very powerful.
Yeah.
Can I add something there?
Yes, of course you can, Mary.
Ask the women who work for you what you're like to work for, and how you are at dealing with women in meetings and in the workplace. Like, actually ask the people who you're seeking to prosper, if you've made a decision to make a change, how's it going? What is there things that I do as a man that affect or don't affect or whatever? So and seek feedback and lead by example also, so that if you're a man in a position of power and you see sexist or whatever behaviour, call it out politely and nicely at the time, so that people know that you don't tolerate that.
Should that be separate from a 360-degree feedback session? Should it be not just about how you're performing at work, but let's have a separate discussion about how I am.
Absolutely a fantastic question, because I've done countless 360s in my time, and I don't think I've ever seen a gender-based question in one. So that is, how good are you at, whatever, however you want to couch it.
How strategic are you?
How strategic are you? That is, I was going to say that I presume there's something you can do that will give you a bit of a spotlight on your level of unconscious bias, or where your weak points are bias-wise, and, be willing to do that, or be willing to ask and listen and see where, what you might need to change.
Just sort of anecdotally, when I've been in performance reviews and that sort of thing, and supposedly there's a you're supposed to be able to have a two-way conversation, but it's very rare that I've seen in my career that men ask for feedback. I'm not saying never, but it is rare.
So that has to change.
Yeah, I think so.
And that's an organisational change.
Yes.
And it has to really be insisted upon, really, doesn't it?
Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Oh, I'll choose this one. Do you experience resistance when you are leading men? Suzie?
I have a team of mainly women and only one guy in my team at the moment. So no, I haven't experienced that.
Okay. Amelia, have you encountered that resistance from leading men?
I have, but I think it was a challenging situation. I wouldn't necessarily say that I sort of overcame it and had a great solution, because we just kind of both naturally moved on to other jobs. But it was a tricky thing, but for me it's been definitely a minority of my experiences.
It's good. I'm not going to ask you, Mary, because we've run out of time. I'm sorry.
Oh.
I hope our panels enjoyed our discussion. I've certainly really enjoyed it. I hope our viewers, participants out there have enjoyed it. Please come back and watch our next webinar on the 24th of September. We're going to be talking about probity, integrity and organisational effectiveness. Our panellists will be Julia Cornwall-McEwen and Chaz Savage, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.